You think remembering the deceased means you haven't moved on or processed your grief properly. Maslow discovered something that contradicts everything popular psychology teaches about loss. In his research on self-actualized individuals who'd experienced profound loss, he found that the psychologically healthiest people didn't let go of those who died. They transformed the relationship into something he called integrated psychological presence. These emotionally mature people were maintaining active internal relationships with deceased loved ones while appearing completely functional to observers. The most revealing part? Maslow identified 7 specific psychological phenomena that indicate someone you love hasn't disappeared from your consciousness. They've been internalized in ways that continue shaping your development. This isn't about ghosts or supernatural contact. This is about how human consciousness preserves, processes, and continues relationships beyond physical death through psychological mechanisms that most grief counseling completely misunderstands. And recognizing these signs means understanding the difference between healthy, continuing bonds and pathological inability to process loss. Not every ongoing sense of connection to deceased loved ones is psychologically healthy. There's a critical difference between what grief researchers call continuing bonds, healthy psychological presence of the deceased, and complicated grief where you're unable to function because you can't accept the death. Maslow observed that many people struggling with loss were either trying to completely sever their connection, believing that's what moving on means, or remaining so attached that they couldn't engage with present reality. But the pattern he documented in psychologically healthy people was completely different. These individuals had internalized aspects of their deceased loved ones in ways that enriched rather than limited their lives. They maintained what felt like ongoing relationship, not through denial of death, but through psychological integration. They could feel the presence of deceased loved ones in their consciousness without believing they were literally present. This wasn't pathology or wishful thinking. This was a natural capacity of human consciousness to preserve important relationships by transforming them from external to internal. What appears as not letting go to grief counselors operating from outdated models is actually sophisticated psychological integration that serves continued development. In this video, I'm going to reveal the 7 psychological signs that indicate someone you've lost remains active in your consciousness in ways that support your growth, based on continuing bonds research and Maslow's observations of how self-actualized people process loss. You'll discover the difference between healthy internalized presence and pathological attachment, and why modern grief psychology increasingly recognizes that the goal isn't to get over loss but to transform a relationship. These are insights from humanistic psychology and contemporary grief research that explain why you might sense, hear, or feel guided by deceased loved ones, and why this might be healthy rather than concerning. By the end, you'll understand which signs indicate adaptive grief processing and which suggest you need additional support. This isn't a video about supernatural contact with the dead or spiritual communication. This is psychology and neuroscience explaining how consciousness maintains relationships beyond physical death through memory, internalization, and continuing psychological bonds. This video is for people who still feel connected to someone who died, who sense their presence or hear their voice in moments of decision, who wonder if they're going crazy or if this is normal, if you feel your deceased loved one guiding you, if you catch yourself having conversations with them in your mind, if certain experiences make you feel their presence, you're about to understand what's actually happening in your consciousness. But warning, this requires distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy grief patterns. If you're ready to understand the psychology of how relationships continue after death, keep watching. Think about the last time you faced a significant decision and found yourself wondering what your deceased loved one would say or do. Maybe you heard their voice in your mind, offering the advice they would have given. Maybe you felt a sense of what they would want for you. That internal dialogue isn't imagination or denial. It's what psychologists call internalized relationship, and is one of the most sophisticated functions of human consciousness. Maslow understood that self-actualized people who experience loss didn't erase the deceased from their psychology. Instead, they transformed the external relationship into an internal one that continued providing meaning, guidance, and connection. The psychological weight of loss never fully disappears, but it can transform from acute pain into integrated presence. You move from "they're gone and I'm devastated" to "they're physically absent but psychologically present in how they shape me." This isn't denial of death. It's recognition that consciousness preserves what matters. The people who shaped you don't vanish when they die. They live on through the values they instilled, the lessons they taught, the love they gave that you internalized. This is a truth that makes grief bearable. Death ends a life but doesn't end a relationship. The relationship continues, transformed in your consciousness. Maslow's hierarchy helps explain why continuing bonds develop and why they're psychologically important. At the love and belonging level, relationships are essential to psychological health. When someone you love dies, you don't suddenly stop needing that relationship. You need to transform it into a form that death hasn't destroyed. This is where continuing bonds emerge. Your consciousness maintains connection through memory, internalization, and what feels like ongoing presence. At the esteem level, deceased loved ones often remain as internal sources of validation, encouragement, or pride. You accomplish something and feel they will be proud. You face challenges and draw strength from what they believed about you. This isn't pathological. It's adaptive use of internalized relationship to support your functioning. At the self-actualization level, people often describe deceased loved ones as having become part of their identity. "I carry them with me" isn't metaphor. It's accurate description of psychological integration. Their values have become your values. Their wisdom informs your choices. Their love remains a foundation of your security, even though they're physically gone. Here's the key insight that transforms how we understand grief. Maslow found that psychologically healthy people don't measure grief recovery by absence of connection to deceased loved ones. They measure it by transformation of connection from something that paralyzes to something that supports continued living. The 7 signs I'm about to reveal indicate this healthy transformation is occurring, that the deceased has moved from external loss to internal presence in ways that serve your psychological development rather than preventing it. These signs appear in a specific pattern that grief researchers have documented across cultures and types of loss, and recognizing them helps distinguish normal grief with continuing bonds from complicated grief requiring intervention. Contemporary grief psychology, particularly the work of researchers like Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman, documented what they call the continuing bonds model in their landmark research. They found that across cultures, healthy grief doesn't mean breaking bond with deceased. It means maintaining them in transformed ways. Their research showed that bereaved people who maintained sense of connection with deceased loved ones often had better psychological outcomes than those who tried to completely let go. The psychologist Robert Niemeyer expanded this, documenting how meaning-making in grief often involves discovering ways the deceased continues to influence your life. He found that people who can articulate how their loved one lives on through them, through values or lessons or love, process grief more adaptively than those who saw death as complete severance. The neuroscientist Mary Frances O'Connor studied the brain during grief and found that neural patterns associated with the deceased remain active long after death. When you think of them, specific neural networks activate. Essentially, they have permanent neural representation in your brain. Your brain has physically encoded them, and that encoding doesn't disappear. This explains why you can vividly recall their voice, their mannerisms, their likely responses to situations. It's not supernatural. It's neurobiology preserving relationship. The psychiatrist Colin Murray Parks documented what he called sense of presence, experiences, the feeling that deceased loved ones are near, watching over you or with you in moments of significance. He found these experiences were nearly universal in early grief and common even years later, and they weren't correlated with psychopathology. Most people experiencing them were psychologically healthy. Insider knowledge from thanatology, the study of death and dying, reveals what Maslow observed. The psychological presence of deceased loved ones serves important functions for the living. It provides comfort, guidance, continuity of identity, and connection to something larger than individual existence. This isn't primitive belief or denial. It's sophisticated psychological adaptation to loss. But here's what research reveals about the specific mechanisms through which deceased loved ones remain in consciousness, and why some forms are adaptive while others indicate complicated grief. The first sign Maslow and grief researchers identified is what's called internalized dialogue. You find yourself having conversations with the deceased in your mind, not through delusion that they're actually responding, but through psychological simulation of what they would say based on your knowledge of them. This is healthy when the dialogue supports your functioning. You're drawing on their wisdom, values, or perspective as you understood them. It becomes concerning only if you believe they're literally speaking to you in ways that override your own judgment, or if the dialogue becomes predominantly critical and damages your self-esteem. The second sign is values continuity. You notice yourself making choices based on values or principles they embodied, not from obligation but from genuine integration. Their approach to life has become part of your approach. This is Maslow's concept of identification with actualized others. You internalize the best of who they were. This is adaptive inheritance, allowing their positive influence to continue shaping your development even after death. The third sign is what researchers call symbolic connection. Certain objects, places, songs, or experiences create sense of connection to them, not because you believe they're magically present, but because these stimuli activate neural networks associated with them, bringing them alive in memory and feeling. This is healthy unless it becomes so rigid that you can't tolerate changes to these symbols, or your life revolves around maintaining them rather than continuing to develop. The fourth sign is sensing presence. In moments of stress, decision, or significance, you feel they're somehow with you, watching, supporting, or guiding. Grief psychology confirms this is remarkably common and not indicative of pathology unless it's accompanied by actual hallucinations that you can't reality test, or if it prevents you from making autonomous decisions. The fifth sign that researchers in Maslow documented is behavioral continuity. You find yourself doing things they used to do, cooking their recipes, using their phrases, approaching problems with methods they taught you. This is psychological identification and internalization, where aspects of them have literally become parts of you. This is adaptive integration, unless you're doing it compulsively to avoid feeling the loss, or you've lost sense of your own distinct identity in the process. The sixth sign is what grief researchers call meaning-making through legacy. You find purpose or meaning in continuing what mattered to them, honoring their memory through action, or ensuring their values or work continue. This transforms grief into generativity, creating something meaningful from loss. This is healthy when it aligns with your authentic values and enhances your life, concerning only if you're sacrificing your own development to serve what you think they would have wanted. The seventh and most significant sign is what Maslow called growth through integrated loss. You recognize that losing them changed you in ways that, while painful, also catalyze development. They remain present in consciousness as part of your ongoing becoming. Their death created transformation that continues unfolding. You carry not just memory of who they were, but ongoing evolution sparked by loving and losing them. This is a marker of mature grief. You can hold both the pain of their absence and the gift of their having been in your life, and both continue shaping you. Research shows this pattern appears in people who successfully process grief while maintaining connection. They're not stuck in loss, but not pretending it didn't matter. The deceased has become integrated psychological presence that supports rather than prevents continued living. The transformation that occurs when you recognize these signs as normal rather than concerning creates immediate shifts in how you experience your grief and your relationship with the deceased. Remember that guilt you might feel about moving forward with life, that worry that you're forgetting them or betraying their memory. Understanding continuing bonds dissolve that completely. You recognize that living fully isn't betrayal. It's honoring the love and the life they gave you. Your grief becomes less about what you lost and more about what you carry forward. Maslow found that self-actualized people who'd experienced loss showed this pattern. They maintained vibrant sense of connection while being fully engaged with present life. They weren't stuck in the past, but they hadn't amputated the past either. Your anxiety about whether you're processing grief correctly decreases, because you understand there's no single correct way. The old model said you should let go and move on. The continuing bonds model recognizes that you transform the relationship and bring them with you. Your sense of isolation and grief often decreases when you recognize how common these experiences are. Most bereaved people sense presence, hear voices, feel guidance from deceased loved ones. You're not crazy or in denial. You're experiencing universal human responses to loss. Your capacity to find meaning in the loss expands when you can articulate how they continue influencing you. Their death isn't just subtraction. It's also transformation of your consciousness in ways that honor what they meant to you. Even your fear of your own death can transform because you recognize that consciousness preserves what matters. You won't be completely erased when you die. You'll live on in the consciousness of those who loved you, just as your loved ones live on in you. Now here's where the full psychological architecture reveals itself, and where understanding continuing bonds transforms not just how you grieve, but how you understand consciousness relationship and what persists beyond physical death. What these 7 signs actually document is consciousness's remarkable capacity to preserve relationship beyond the death of one participant. From a materialist perspective, when someone dies, the relationship is over, they no longer exist, so connection is impossible. But psychological research reveals something more complex. Relationships exist in consciousness, not just in physical proximity. When someone you love dies, half the relationship is lost, but the other half, your side, your internalization, your neural representation of them, remains. And because your brain has encoded them so thoroughly, you can continue relating to them internally in ways that feel remarkably like the external relationship. This isn't delusion. It's the power of memory internalization and neural encoding. Your consciousness contains working models of important others that remain active after death. You know how they respond to situations because you've internalized their patterns. You can feel their presence because neural networks associated with them activate. You hear their voice because you've heard it thousands of times and your brain can reproduce it. All of this is naturalistic, material process, and it's also deeply meaningful and real as psychological experience. Here's what makes this both scientifically accurate and emotionally profound. Consciousness doesn't distinguish sharply between external and internal relationships in terms of psychological impact. The internal relationship with a deceased parent can provide as much guidance, comfort, and influence as an external relationship with a living person. This is why continuing bonds are adaptive. They allow a relationship to serve ongoing development even after physical death. But there's a critical distinction that determines whether continuing bonds are healthy or pathological. Healthy continuing bonds involve maintaining psychological connection while accepting the reality of death. You know they're dead, you process that loss, but you maintain sense of relationship through memory and internalization. Pathological complicated grief involves inability to accept death. You're relating to them as if they're still alive in ways that prevent you from functioning. The difference isn't whether you feel connection. It's whether you can reality test and whether the connection supports or prevents continued living. If you're experiencing these 7 signs, if deceased loved ones remain vividly present in your consciousness, you're likely experiencing healthy continuing bonds rather than complicated grief. If you can acknowledge they're dead even while feeling connected, the sense of connection comforts rather than torments you. You can make autonomous decisions even while considering what they think. You're continuing to develop and grow rather than being frozen in grief, and the relationship feels transformed rather than unchanged by death. If these conditions are met, your experience reflects sophisticated psychological adaptation to loss rather than pathology requiring intervention. Maslow's final insight about grief was that self-actualized people who experience profound loss often reported that the loss, while devastating, had also deepened them in ways nothing else could. They carried their deceased loved ones not as burden, but as integrated presence that enhanced their capacity for love, meaning, and appreciation of life's preciousness. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what psychology knows about communicating with deceased loved ones through dream work and active imagination. Not supernatural contact, but conscious engagement with internalized psychological presence in ways that support grief processing and continuing development. Until then, if you're experiencing these signs of continuing connection, understand you're not avoiding grief. You're processing in ways that honor both the loss and the enduring significance of the relationship. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of grief, loss, and how consciousness maintains relationships beyond death.